around my phone as I opened them one by one. Each photo was a dagger to my chest, a moment stolen from the shadows, exposing something I had convinced myself was invisible. Me and Diego. His hand resting a second too long on my waist. His lips too close to my ear as he whispered something that made me laugh. A single frame where my fingers curled around his wrist in a way that wasn't friendly, wasn't innocent. My stomach twisted violently as the weight of what I was seeing pressed down on me. Someone had been watching. Someone knew. Before I could think, another message came in. Casablanca. 8 p.m. Come alone. No threats, no demands, just that. A simple instruction that sent ice down my spine. My first instinct was to delete everything, to pretend it never happened, but I knew better. This wasn't something I could erase with the swipe of a finger. My throat tightened as my mind spiraled through possibilities. Who? What? Was it a warning? A trap? Was it God? Was it him? My hands shook as I locked my phone and set it down on the kitchen counter, staring at it like it might explode. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made everything feel surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life. How the hell had I let it get this far? I ran a hand through my hair, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. My reflection in the kitchen window stared back at me, wide-eyed, exposed. I needed to think. I needed to fix this. But first, I needed to know who was waiting for me tonight. Casablanca was the kind of place where money whispered instead of shouted. The lighting was low, the hum of conversation smooth and effortless, the scent of aged wine and seared steak curling through the air. I stepped inside, my heart slamming against my ribs as I scanned the room, searching, dreading. Then I saw him. He was alone at a corner table, mid-40s, sharp eyes, expensive but understated suit. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't hurried. He swirled a glass of red wine between his fingers, watching me like he'd already won. My feet felt heavy as I forced myself forward, each step tightening the invisible noose around my neck. I sat across from him, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. He took his time setting down his glass, studying me with something like amusement. "You're late," he said. "I don't know who you are," I replied, keeping my voice steady, controlled, but inside I was unraveling at the seams. "Or what you think you..." He slid his phone across the table. The same pictures. My stomach flipped, my face burning hot and cold at the same time. "You know exactly what this is," he said smoothly. "And you know what's at stake." My breath came short and shallow. "Who are you? What do you want? How much do you know?" The questions clawed at my throat, but I bit them back. If I let him see the fear I'd already lost. He leaned forward slightly, the low glow of the candle on the table catching in his eyes. "Relax," he murmured. "I'm not here to ruin your life." I didn't believe him. "What do you want?" I managed, my voice barely more than a whisper. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's the question, isn't it?" The waiter appeared beside us, asking if I wanted something to drink, and I barely registered my own response. My world was tilting, shifting under me, and I had no footing. My pulse hammered in my ears, my mind racing in 100 directions. Who was he? How long had he been watching? How much did he know? And more importantly, what the hell was I going to do now? 6 months ago, none of this would have been possible. 6 months ago, my life was quiet, predictable, comfortable even. Then Diego arrived. It was supposed to be temporary, just a few months while he figured out his next steps. He was family after all. It made sense for him to stay with us. At least that's what I told myself. But from the moment he stepped through our front door, something shifted. He was taller than I remembered, broader. His confidence filled the space, an energy that felt too big for the house for me. His smile was easy, his charm effortless, and when he looked at me, really looked at me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. That first night we sat around the dining table, the three of us drinking, laughing. Diego told stories, leaning back in his chair, his dark eyes flicking to mine with something unreadable behind them. I had convinced myself it was nothing. Now staring at those photos, feeling the weight of that stranger's gaze on me, I knew better. It wasn't nothing. It was everything. The house felt different without Luis. It wasn't just the silence. It was the space, the emptiness, the way the air itself seemed lighter without his presence filling every room. He had left that morning, a quick peck on my cheek, a promise to call, his mind already somewhere else before he even walked out the door. Now it was just me. And Diego. I tried not to think about it. I poured myself a coffee, scrolled mindlessly through my phone, pretended everything was normal. But normal had started slipping away the day Diego moved in. I could hear him moving upstairs, the sound of water running, the occasional clang of metal against porcelain. Repair, he had said. Something with the pipes. I hadn't asked questions, hadn't offered help, but now the noise was getting louder, more persistent, until finally, there was a sharp clank followed by a muttered curse. Curiosity pulled me up the stairs before logic could stop me. The bathroom door was open just enough for steam to curl out into the hall, the scent of soap and metal hanging thick in the air. Diego was crouched by the sink, sleeves rolled up, forearms taut as he twisted at something under the cabinet. The fabric of his shirt clung to his back, slightly damp, as if he had already been at this for too long. "Everything okay?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe, my voice lighter than I felt. He didn't turn, just huffed a frustrated breath. "Yeah. Almost done. I should have left. I should have turned around and gone back downstairs. But I didn't. Instead, I took a step closer just as he adjusted a pipe, just as water surged from somewhere it shouldn't, just as it sprayed out, cold, sudden, unstoppable, straight at me. A sharp gasp shot from my lips as the water drenched my shirt, seeping through the fabric in an instant, chilling my skin. Diego jerked back, eyes widening as he took in what he'd done, and for a second there was silence. Just the drip 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 of water and the sound of my own uneven breath. Then I laughed, quick and breathless, shaking my hands out, water splashing onto the tile. "Well," I managed between laughs, "I guess that answers my question." Diego grinned, a slow, easy stretch of his lips that shouldn't have made my stomach tighten the way it did. "Guess so." His gaze dipped, just for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to know he had noticed how the water had made my shirt cling. My skin prickled under the weight of it, under the heat of his stare, and suddenly the air in the bathroom was different. He was close, too close, and neither of us was moving. I should have said something. I should have grabbed a towel, stepped away, broken the moment before it became something it shouldn't. But then his hand brushed against mine. It was barely a touch, the ghost of contact, the kind of thing that could be excused, ignored, forgotten in an instant. But neither of us forgot. Neither of us moved. My fingers burned where his skin had met mine, a slow, steady heat that crawled up my arm, across my chest, down my spine. His breathing had changed, deepened, his body still waiting. I swallowed hard. "Diego." He didn't let go. I should have pulled away. I should have stepped back. Instead, I stood there, water dripping from my hair, my clothes clinging to me, my pulse thrumming so hard I was sure he could hear it. His fingers flexed just slightly, not enough to be anything but enough to be everything. Then just as quickly he pulled back. The moment shattered, breaking apart like glass, leaving me breathless and unsteady. "Sorry," he murmured, but there was something in his voice, something that made it clear he wasn't. I turned, forcing myself to leave, forcing my legs to move, forcing myself to pretend that whatever had just happened between us hadn't happened at all. But as I walked down the hall, my fingers still tingled where he had touched me. And deep down I knew, this wasn't over. The night was quiet, thick, with the kind of stillness that made everything feel sharper, heavier, more real. The house sat behind me, dark and silent, but out here on the terrace the air was cool, the scent of the ocean carried in the breeze, the distant hum of the city barely a whisper. I cradled a glass of wine in my hands, the deep red liquid swirling against the glass, reflecting the dim glow of the patio lights. I told myself I had come out here for the quiet, to clear my head, to breathe. But the truth sat heavier than the wine on my tongue. I was waiting. And then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, he was there. Diego stepped onto the terrace without a sound, his presence shifting the air around me, his movements slow, unhurried, as if he already knew I wouldn't tell him to leave. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the railing a few feet away, his own glass in hand, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. I should have ignored him. I should have pretended I didn't notice the way his shirt stretched across his chest, the way the faint glow of the light caught the sharp angles of his face. Instead, I took another sip, the warmth of the wine sinking into my veins, loosening the edges of my restraint. "Couldn't sleep?" he finally said, his voice low, steady, almost knowing. I shrugged, watching the way the night stretched endlessly before us. "Something like that." Silence settled between us, thick and heavy, unspoken words filling the spaces where safe conversation should have been. He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding mine, and for a moment neither of us looked away. The air crackled, tension woven into the space between us, something unspoken hanging just beneath the surface. Then his lips curved into something almost amused, something that made my fingers tighten around the stem of my glass. Luis doesn't understand what he has. The words landed like a match against dry wood, the sudden flicker of heat licking up my spine, burning through the last of my control. I let out a small laugh, quick and sharp, something meant to brush it off, to push away whatever he was doing. But inside, my pulse stumbled, my breath catching at the implication buried beneath his words. I turned my gaze back to the city lights, forcing my voice to remain even. "And what exactly do you think that means?" His eyes never left me, and when he finally spoke, there was something almost too careful in his tone, something too intentional. "I think he sees what he expects to see." "What's easy to see?" He took a slow sip of wine, his throat moving as he swallowed, his expression unreadable. "Not what's actually in front of him." A slow, deep ache curled low in my stomach, a warning I should have listened to. This wasn't safe. This wasn't normal. But I still wasn't stopping. I forced out another laugh, lighter this time, as if that could break whatever was happening. "That's a dangerous thing to say." Diego tilted his head slightly, his gaze dropping, dragging over my face like he was memorizing something, like he was waiting. Then, as if deciding something in real time, he pushed off the railing, closing the space between us, slow, deliberate, an invitation and a challenge wrapped in a single step. "I'm not afraid of danger." His voice dropped lower, rougher, something just on the edge of something dangerous. "I'm not afraid of you." I swallowed hard, gripping my glass tighter, but I didn't move. Then, softer, quieter, a confession wrapped in temptation. "I'm afraid of what I feel." The words pressed into my skin, my bones, my breath catching on something I could not afford to name. I should have ended it right there. I should have laughed again, tossed back the rest of my wine, walked away, gone inside, closed the door between us. But I didn't. I just stood there, the night pressing in around us, the heat between us rising, unstoppable. The days passed in a slow, unbearable tension, each moment stretched thin with the weight of what had been left unsaid. I avoided him. I avoided his gaze at breakfast, his voice in the hallway, his presence in the spaces we once moved through so easily. I told myself it was control, that if I could put enough distance between us, whatever had started on that terrace would disappear, dissolve into something I could pretend never existed. But distance was an illusion in a house that wasn't big enough to hold the silence swelling between us, and no matter how much space I tried to put between us, I felt him. I felt him when he walked past, close enough that the air shifted. I felt him when I heard the sound of his voice from another room, low and measured, something I wasn't supposed to pay attention to but did anyway. I felt him in the way my body tensed when I knew he was near, in the way my pulse betrayed me, in the way something inside me waited. And then one night everything broke. The house was dark, silent except for the faint creaks of settling wood, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the rhythm of my own breath as I padded down the stairs, barefoot, the tile cool beneath my feet. I wasn't thinking about him. I wasn't thinking about anything except the glass of water I had come for, the thirst in my throat, the need to clear my mind. But when I stepped into the kitchen, I wasn't alone. He was there. Diego stood by the counter, his back to me, the dim glow of the streetlights outside casting long shadows across his frame. He didn't turn when I entered, but he didn't need to. He knew I was there. The silence between us was immediate, thick, something alive and breathing, something neither of us knew how to control. I should have left. I should have turned around, pretended I hadn't seen him, walked back up the stairs and disappeared into my room like this moment had never existed. But I didn't. I couldn't. I took a step forward, the floor cool beneath my bare feet, my breath shallow, my heartbeat suddenly too loud. He finally turned, and for a long moment we just stood there. No words. No movements. Just the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing into the space between us. The air was thick with something I didn't have a name for, something heavy and electric, something that had been waiting too long to be acknowledged. I told myself to speak, to break the silence, to put anything between us that would stop whatever was about to happen before it started. But my body betrayed me, my hands tightening at my sides, my pulse a dull roar in my ears. And then he moved. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't rushed. It was slow, deliberate, a quiet acceptance of something we had both been pretending wasn't there. His fingers brushed against my wrist first, barely there, a whisper of contact that sent a tremor down my spine. He didn't stop. He let his touch travel upward along the curve of my arm, barely pressing into my skin, but burning everywhere he made contact. I didn't move. I should have. I should have stepped back, said something broken the moment before it shattered everything. But I stood there, frozen in place as his fingers traced higher over my shoulder, along the delicate line of my collarbone, until they stopped, just below my jaw, tilting my face toward his. His breath was warm against my skin, his eyes dark, unreadable. He didn't ask. He didn't wait. His lips brushed against mine, a hesitant question in a language we had been speaking without words for weeks. It was nothing and it was everything. And then I shoved him away. The moment broke like glass, splintering between us as I stumbled back, my breath ragged, my hands trembling. My heart slammed against my ribs, panic clawing its way up my throat as reality came crashing back down around me. I turned and walked away without a word. But we both knew. It was already too late. I told myself it was over. That night in the kitchen was a mistake, a moment of weakness that meant nothing, that could be erased if I just acted normal. I spent the next few days proving it to myself, holding my head high, pretending that nothing had changed, that I didn't feel the weight of his stare whenever he was near, that my skin didn't burn where he had touched me, that my mind didn't replay it when I closed my eyes at night. I convinced myself I was in control, that this was just a passing storm, something that would settle if I just ignored it. But Diego had other plans. At breakfast he sat across from me, casual, effortless, as if nothing had happened. But then his knee brushed mine under the table. A flicker of contact, gone in a second, but enough to make my fingers tighten around my fork. A warning. A challenge. He reached for the coffee pot, his hand grazing mine in a way that wasn't necessary, his fingertips pressing into my skin just a second too long, his eyes watching me when I flinched but didn't pull away fast enough. I forced myself to ignore it, to breathe, to keep my voice steady when Luis asked about my plans for the day, to pretend I wasn't hyper-aware of Diego's every movement, of the way he leaned back in his chair, studying me like he was waiting for me to break. But the worst part wasn't the touches, it was his eyes. Later that afternoon I went to the pool, desperate for space, for air, for a moment to remember who I was before all of this. The water was cool, the sun warm on my skin, and for the first time in days I felt something close to normal. And then I felt him. I didn't look at first, but I knew. His presence changed the air, thickened it, made it heavier. He sat on the edge of the lounge chair, stretching, moving like he didn't have a care in the world, but when I finally turned my head, his gaze was locked on me. So, unapologetic. Dragging down my body in a way that wasn't subtle, in a way that made my skin prickle with something I couldn't name, in a way that should have made me angry but instead made my breath hitch. He didn't look away. He didn't hide it. I should have left. Had I stayed. That night the house was quiet. Luis was in his office, the glow of his computer screen flickering under the closed door, lost in a world that didn't include me. I took a shower, letting the water scald my skin, as if it could wash away the way Diego had looked at me. Steam filled the bathroom, the mirror fogging over, everything blurred, softened, easier to ignore. I reached for my towel, rubbing it over my face, and when I looked back at the mirror my breath caught. "You want this." 3 words. Written in the steam. My stomach plummeted. I spun, my pulse hammering, my breath shallow, searching the empty bathroom, the silent hallway beyond the cracked door. No sound. No sign of him. But he had been here. He had written it. And he knew I would see it. Something inside me snapped. I stormed out of the bathroom, still damp, heart pounding, feet silent against the floor as I moved through the hall, down the stairs, through the dimly lit house until I found him. Diego stood by the open patio doors, his back to me, shoulders relaxed as if he hadn't just lit my entire body on fire. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed his arm, spun him around and kissed him. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was heat and anger and frustration and surrender, my fingers tangling in his shirt, pulling him closer, his hands finding my waist, his grip firm, unrelenting. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask. He just took what I was finally, desperately giving. And in that moment I knew. I had lost. The house was too quiet. Luis was gone, another business trip, another excuse, another night where I pretended the silence didn't feel heavier than his presence. I told myself I was fine, that the extra space meant nothing, that the air wasn't thicker, that my hands weren't shaking when I poured myself a glass of wine. I told myself Diego wasn't watching me from the kitchen, leaning against the counter like he belonged there, like he knew exactly what I had done, like he knew I was already too far gone to turn back. I had spent the morning avoiding him, the afternoon pretending he wasn't there, the evening convincing myself that last night had been a mistake, that the way my body had reacted to him wasn't real, that it could be undone. But now, standing in the dim light of the living room, I felt the weight of his gaze settle on me, slow, measured, intentional. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said finally, voice low, steady, the kind of voice that made my breath catch. I forced a laugh, too sharp, too brittle. "I'm not." He took a step closer, deliberate, closing the space between us inch by inch. "Then prove it." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. "What do you mean?" His eyes darkened, something unreadable flashing across them. "If it was nothing, if it didn't mean anything, kiss me again." The air shifted. I felt it in my bones, in the way my skin tightened, in the way my lungs forgot how to work, in the way my hands curled at my sides because I knew. This was a game. A dangerous, impossible, inevitable game. And I was losing. I should have walked away. I should have laughed, thrown his challenge back in his face, reminded him that what happened last night was a mistake, something that couldn't happen again, something that would destroy everything. But I didn't. Because I wasn't sure I believed that anymore. Because I was tired of pretending. Because deep down, under the guilt and the fear and the ache of wanting something I had no right to want, I wanted to lose. So I kissed him. At first it was hesitation wrapped in defiance, a desperate attempt to prove something, to myself, to him, to both of us. But the second his lips met mine, the second my fingers twisted into his shirt, the second he pulled me against him like he had been waiting for this forever, it stopped being a test. It became real. The kiss deepened, his hands firm against my waist, my back pressing into the wall. The heat between us a slow burn that exploded the moment I let go, the moment I stopped fighting, the moment I stopped thinking. His fingers traced up my spine, sending shivers down my body. My breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a moan as he pulled me closer, closer, until there was nothing left between us. I didn't care how wrong it was. I didn't care that I couldn't take this back. I didn't care about anything except this. I needed more. I wanted more. And I knew deep in the pit of my stomach that I was already too far gone. Time blurred, seconds stretched into minutes, the taste of him on my lips, the warmth of his skin against mine, the way he knew exactly what I wanted without me having to say a word. My hands tangled in his hair, his grip tightening, and I let him. I let him because I wanted to. I let him because stopping felt impossible. I let him because the moment I gave in, nothing had ever felt more right. Then just as suddenly as it started, he pulled back. My chest heaved, my breath short, my body still aching for something I wasn't ready to name. His gaze was unreadable, his expression carefully controlled, but there was something behind his eyes. Something dark, something knowing, something dangerous. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, before I could think, he said it. "You think this is simple?" The words hit me hard, because it wasn't. And we both knew it. Luis's return felt like a storm rolling in, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me in a way it never had before. I had always welcomed him home, always fallen easily into the rhythm of our routine, but now, the moment he stepped through the door, something inside me tightened. His presence wasn't just familiar. It was intrusive, a reminder of what I had done, of what I had become. I forced a smile, greeted him like I always did, kissed his cheek like I always had, but my hands felt cold, my voice felt wrong, and when his arms wrapped around me, my body didn't react the way it was supposed to. Everything about me was different now, and I didn't know how to hide it. At dinner, I picked at my food, barely hearing the details of his trip, nodding when I was supposed to, laughing at the right moments, but the weight of Diego's gaze from across the table burned into my skin. He hadn't looked at me like that before Luis left. He had been careful then, measured, hesitant even. But now he sat there with an ease that terrified me, his posture relaxed, his smirk small but deliberate, his confidence humming just beneath the surface like he knew something I didn't. Every time I tried to meet his gaze, my breath caught in my throat because there was nothing uncertain about him anymore. I felt his foot brush mine under the table. I nearly dropped my fork. I yanked my leg away so fast it was obvious, and Luis paused mid-sentence, his brows pulling together. "You okay?" His voice was steady, familiar, the same voice I had fallen asleep to for years, but now it felt foreign. I nodded too quickly, my heartbeat hammering, my fingers curling into my palm. "Yeah." Just tired. Diego smirked over the rim of his glass. I couldn't breathe. The next day, Sophia showed up unannounced, breezing through my front door like she always had, her presence sharp, her eyes scanning me with a look that made my stomach twist. I knew her too well and she knew me even better, which meant the second I fumbled through a greeting, the second I avoided her gaze, the second she caught the way my hands shook just slightly when I set down our coffee cups, she knew something was wrong. She waited until I sat down, waited until I forced a sip past my too dry lips, waited until I exhaled like I had finally fooled her into believing I was fine. Then she leaned in, elbows on the counter, head tilted, and pinned me with a look that made my skin crawl. You're acting weird. I laughed too fast, too sharp, my fingers tightening around my mug like it could hold me together. I'm not. You are. I forced another smile, forced my voice to stay even, forced myself to lie. Luis just got back. It always takes me a few days to get used to him being home again. She didn't blink. She didn't believe me. Her eyes flicked over my face, searching, peeling me apart like she had every tool she needed to get inside my head. And the longer she stared, the more I felt the cracks in my armor begin to widen. She opened her mouth, ready to press, ready to dig, but before she could, Diego walked in. And suddenly everything shifted. He wasn't cautious. He wasn't careful. He wasn't pretending we didn't exist in some unspoken space. He just grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, leaned against the counter with the same calm control I had seen the night Luis came home, and watched me fall apart. Sophia looked at me. Then she looked at him. Then back at me. And I felt my stomach drop. Diego smirked, just slightly, and for the first time, I realized that whatever had happened between us wasn't something he wanted to bury. It was something he wanted to play with. The air was heavy with the thick warmth of an early evening, the scent of freshly cut grass and distant ocean salt lingering as I walked through the quiet neighborhood. I had needed to get out of the house, away from the walls that felt like they were closing in, away from the way Diego had been looking at me, away from the way my own body had started betraying me. My thoughts were too loud, my pulse too fast, my hands still unsteady from the weight of everything I was trying to undo. And then, just as I turned the corner, I almost collided with him. Marcos. It happened so quickly, the sharp inhale, the staggered step back, the quick apology on my lips before I even got a good look at him. But when I did, something inside me paused. He wasn't like the men around here, the polished, tailored professionals who moved through this neighborhood like they owned it. He had a quiet confidence about him, a roughness in the way his dark eyes settled on me, a lazy smirk tugging at the corner of his lips like he already knew how this was going to end. You okay? His voice was deep, smooth, the kind that settled in your bones and stayed there. I nodded too quickly, forcing a small laugh, brushing non-existent dust from my dress just to have something to do with my hands. Yeah, sorry. I wasn't paying attention. He studied me for a second, a long, deliberate moment that made my skin prickle. No harm done. I told myself to keep walking. I told myself not to engage. But something about him pulled at me, a sharp reminder that I had been playing a dangerous game with only one player, and maybe it was time to even the odds. We talked. It was easy, natural, the kind of conversation that didn't require effort, that let me breathe for the first time in days. He had moved in recently, just a few houses down, a short-term stay, no real ties to anything here. Something about that made my chest loosen, like I could step into this conversation and out of everything else just for a little while. And when he smiled, slow and knowing, I felt something flicker inside me that I hadn't expected. Interest. Possibility. But I wasn't the only one watching. I felt it before I saw him, the shift in the air, the way my spine tensed before my eyes followed the pull of an unseen thread. Diego stood near the house, his arms crossed, his stance casual but his expression anything but. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched, his gaze locked onto mine like he could feel what I was trying to do, like he could see the way Marcos had made me forget, just for a moment, that he even existed. And suddenly this wasn't an escape anymore. It was a trap. I said goodbye too quickly, turned back toward the house, my heart hammering as I forced my legs to move faster, as I pretended Diego wasn't standing there like a warning. He didn't say anything when I passed him, didn't stop me, didn't reach for me. But his silence burned into my skin, his presence wrapping around my throat like an invisible chain. That night, I tried to shake it off, to tell myself I had imagined the way his jaw had tensed, the way his eyes had darkened, the way he had wanted to rip me away from that conversation. But when I pulled my phone from the nightstand, my breath stopped cold. A new message. A new photo. It wasn't Diego. It wasn't Marcos. It was me. Taken from a distance. Unmistakable. Unforgiving. A new photo. It wasn't Diego. It wasn't Marcos. It was me. Taken from a distance. Unmistakable. Unforgiving. And below it just 2 words. Be careful. Luis never planned things last minute. He was meticulous, controlled, deliberate in everything he did. So when he mentioned over breakfast that he wanted to host a dinner that evening, something in my stomach twisted. He had been gone for days, barely home long enough to settle back into routine, yet here he was insisting on an impromptu gathering, acting as if it was just another casual evening with friends. But it wasn't. I felt it. The house was immaculate by the time the guests arrived, every candle flickering, every surface polished, every detail arranged like the set of a performance where I was suddenly center stage. I moved through the motions, smiling, laughing at the right moments, keeping my voice light, my hands steady, my nerves buried under a thick layer of practiced calm. But inside everything was wrong. Diego sat across the table, his presence heavier than it had ever been, his gaze finding mine when he thought no one was looking, his smirk just a fraction too sharp, too knowing. Marcos was there too, a casual guest, a coincidence that wasn't a coincidence at all, his easy charm wrapping around the room, his attention flicking to me just enough times to make my throat go dry. And Luis. Luis sat at the head of the table, relaxed, entertained, pouring wine, telling stories, acting as though nothing in the world was amiss. But something was. I felt it with every passing second, every flicker of his gaze, every glance he sent my way that lingered just a little too long. It was subtle, careful, deliberate, a silent noose tightening, an invisible web closing in, and I was the only one who knew I was caught. My hands felt too warm, my dress too tight, my breath too shallow as I reached for my glass, taking a slow sip, willing myself to breathe, to hold my composure, to make it through the night without falling apart. And then Luis looked at me. Really looked at me. His voice was casual, his tone light, but his eyes were a warning. Can you imagine, he said, swirling his wine slowly, deliberately, if I knew everything? The words hit me like a cold blade, slicing through the room, through the laughter, through the meaningless conversations that suddenly felt like background noise to something much, much bigger. I froze. For one terrible second I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think, the glass in my hand suddenly too heavy, the air in my lungs suddenly too sharp, the walls around me too close. He knew. Or he wanted me to think he knew. But which one was it? I forced a laugh, forced my lips to move, forced my heartbeat to slow as I tilted my head just slightly, pretending I didn't feel the ground cracking beneath me. Everything. I echoed, my voice smooth, my smile barely there, my entire body balanced on the edge of something I couldn't name. Luis held my gaze, let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words sink in just enough before he smiled, easy, effortless, as if he hadn't just peeled my skin back layer by layer. Forget it, he said, shaking his head, reaching for his fork like nothing had happened. Just a thought. But it wasn't just a thought. It was a trap. And I had no idea if I had just walked straight into it. The moment I saw him, I knew everything was about to fall apart. He was already seated at the corner table, the same one from before, the dim restaurant lights flickering over his sharp features, his wine glass half full, his posture relaxed in a way that felt almost cruel. He had been waiting. Not just for me but for this moment, for the final crack to splinter my carefully built world into something unrecognizable. My pulse hammered as I slid into the seat across from him, my fingers tightening around my clutch, my breath barely steady enough to speak. He smiled, slow and knowing, like he had already won. I told you this wasn't over. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, to pretend this wasn't happening, to pretend I didn't already know what he was about to show me. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I just watched as he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen and turned it toward me. My stomach dropped. It wasn't Diego this time. It was Marcos. Me and him. In my bed. Tangled in sheets. My head tilted back, his lips at my neck, my hands gripping his shoulders, my face unmistakable. The air was sucked from my lungs, my vision blurred, my ears rang with the weight of what I was looking at. This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't a mistake I could tuck away, bury, pretend never happened. Someone had set me up. I forced myself to look up, forced myself to meet his eyes, forced my voice not to shake when I spoke. What do you want? He smiled again, but this time it wasn't amusement. It was satisfaction. You'll see. The dinner party was still going when I got home, laughter and conversation drifting through the open patio doors, the scent of grilled steak and expensive wine lingering in the air. The second I stepped inside, Luis's eyes found me, pinning me in place, cold, unreadable, dangerous in a way I had never seen before. I barely had time to register the shift in the room before his voice cut through the noise. "Give me your phone." The entire room fell silent. My heart slammed against my ribs, my fingers tightening around the device in my hand, my pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe. Luis didn't ask again. He stepped forward, grabbed my wrist and ripped the phone from my grasp before I could react. My body went cold, my throat locked, panic clawing at my insides as he lifted the screen, his jaw clenching as he scrolled, his expression darkening with every second that passed. Then without a word he turned and threw my phone into the pool. The splash was deafening in the silence. My breath caught. The room watched. Luis's voice was calm, steady, razor-sharp. "Tell me, Camila." He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "How long have you been lying to me?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, Diego, Marcos, Sofia, the other guests, all of them watching as my world unraveled at my feet. And then, without waiting for an answer, Luis turned and walked inside, his footsteps heavy, final, like a door slamming shut. I didn't stay. I couldn't. I grabbed my coat, my keys, my breath still caught somewhere in my throat, my body still reeling from the explosion that had just gone off in the middle of my life. I pushed past the whispers, the stares, the weight of Diego's gaze burning into my back and stepped out into the night. The streets were empty, dark, the cool wind biting against my skin as I walked without a destination, without a plan, without anything except the wreckage I had left behind. My thoughts were scattered, my chest tight, my mind looping over every mistake, every misstep, every moment I had let this happen. Then my phone vibrated. Except my phone was at the bottom of the pool. I froze, my breath turning sharp, my fingers trembling as I pulled a different phone from my coat pocket. It wasn't mine. It was a burner. The screen lit up, a single message waiting. "This is just the beginning." My blood ran cold,